again, we would have to work with that in the context of it not having happened, and there would invariably be a consequence. But I think I really wouldn't get tied up too much in the phrase aspirational, because from my point of view, it's aspirational based on a good understanding of our own organisation. We can see where if we deliver what we've planned, there is efficiencies to be made. And it's about how quickly we can bring forward the benefits of that investment to then make those efficiencies. So those efficiencies aren't a finger in the air or a guess. They're set against existing structures, processes, and capabilities.
Okay, thank you. And finally, you've been benefiting from the recruitment fees delivering some savings to you. Yeah. At what point do you think this may lead to a drop in your performance levels, in your operational performance levels?
I think we're at that tipping point now. So I would anticipate us commencing recruitment in the new year. We're getting good support from colleagues in the Greater London Authority in order to progress that, because what we've done really over the course of the pandemic, recognising the very great financial uncertainty in that environment, was to make a prudent decision, and it was always a temporary measure, to freeze recruitment to achieve, I think it was £14.7 million worth of savings in the financial year we're in. But we never intended it to last forever. You can't do that and maintain the level of operational service we need to. We estimate we're at the beginnings of the tipping point where we need to start it up again, and we're working with colleagues in the GLA to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner.
Andy, the savings targets being aspirational is really what worries me, because this is a draft budget. You've just said that you had a good understanding of your organisation, which I believe you do. But if you've got such a good understanding of it, and you demand that these savings are made, why have we not got more detail on where these will be within this draft budget? Because it is, I mean, when I saw this, the one thing that shrieked out of me more than anything was the lack of information around the savings.
So if we talk about that 1 million as an example, there will be sensitivities about how we proceed with that, and we will need to plan that appropriately in the context of our legal duties as an organisation, and how we identify and then communicate those savings. But just to be clear, the use of the word aspiration is perhaps not one I would have taken, because I am clear that I think there are efficiencies to be made in the organisation, and we will do so on the basis of the investment we're making. Part of the investment will give us both the competency and capability to plan those in detail, but we can see because the investment we're bringing in is balanced where we think the savings are going to be achieved.
Okay, but I for sure would have liked to have seen far more meat on the bone on this, and this worries me considerably. On Savings 5, which is on page 49, it's for just under 300k, and that's in 24-25. And it's essentially an ask of the London Fire Brigade contractors to come forward with any ideas of saving money. The explanation states, and I'm quoting, "The figures are a target with no current detail to back them up." Do you think that's an appropriate or achievable saving to actually include in a budget submission?
I think in the scale of what we procure and our existing contracts, yes, because that's based on a historical approach to working with contractors to drive down cost. So many of the contracts we have savings targets within them, and we work continuously with contractors in what is sometimes evolving fields. So, for example, the cost of technology invariably starts to come down. Sometimes we identify partnership opportunities where we can leverage in our contracts with other fire and rescue services or other partners. So we think we've been fairly judicious with that because of the scale of the contracts we hold, and I would expect us to meet that. But that is an evolving picture. I think it's reasonable to make that projection because history tells us that contracts shift and the outcomes they deliver shift with it, whether we look at training or fleet or even our approach to property, which has evolved very considerably over the past 2 years.
Okay, but experience also tells us that when we're looking at savings without any meat on the bone, if you like. It doesn't give confidence that they will be met. We'll write to you about that, and if you can write back to us, even if it's in confidence about where you're looking, if there's a sensitivity to it, I do understand that. But I'm very concerned about this budget, and I would just like to see a lot more. But we'll move on now to the growth proposals, and that's going to be led by my Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Obviously, I haven't got the Deputy Mayor here because she's unwell, and who is sort of covering her work while she's off? Who is kind of asking you the difficult questions on a day-to-day basis?
So a mixture of colleagues who work for the Deputy Mayor within the fire team, and also David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff. I have regular contact with him. I've spoken to David probably 4 or 5 times this week on different matters. So
gosh, that's
it's been quite a busy week coming out of the back end of the Grenfell inquiry and with some of the challenges of the pandemic. So yes, we have very regular contact with David, and he does indeed ask the searching questions.
I'm sure. No, I just for my mind, just wanted to get that, and also we would wish Fiona to get well soon. Obviously, you're managing this whole process, but if you take a step back, what's your honest assessment on the progress you're making to deliver your transformation delivery plan and the HMI's recommendations, which clearly a lot of your budget is around in terms of growth?
I would say the same thing to this committee that I've said to the Inspectorate, that I said and spoken to public record at the inquiry, which is we are making good progress against that combined total of 66 recommendations. So if we take the GTI recommendations, so the Grenfell Town Inquiry recommendations, there were 29 relating either directly to us, 15 of them relating directly to us, 14 that included other emergency services and the National Fire and Rescue services. We have completed 23 of those as we sit here today. Another 3, so that takes us to 26, will be completed by the end of December. And then there's 3 longer-term projects that extend beyond 21, 22 because of their complexity and scale. And I can give you some of the detail on that. So, for example, if I go to recommendation, bear with me, 7, around storing electronic building plans and making them available for responding to incidents. We have an interim position. We've greatly improved the operational risk database. We've inspected 8,500 high-rises in London, and we have, plans for all of those in place. We need a consolidated database for London. That will take years to bring into operation. We're talking maybe 3 years because it doesn't exist, and we're drawing information from data sources beyond the boundaries of the London Fire Brigade. So that is a long-term IT project that will take time to deliver. That's one of the outstanding 3. If we talk about the procurement of new breathing apparatus and radio communications, because we took a sensible decision not to run those in isolation when the 2 bits of kit need to be integrated, we're looking at new breathing apparatus to be starting to be delivered in 2022 and radios before that. So I think we're making good progress against those specific recommendations. But what I am alive to is that after the Lacanau House fire in 2009, there was a similar action plan in the London Fire Brigade where people made absolute best endeavour to meet a long, complex and detailed action plan. From my perspective, having heard some very disturbing evidence in the inquiry, what we then failed to do as an organisation is sustain that change. So I think it is one thing to say that you have completed actions on a plan in the moment. It is another thing entirely to sustain that change generationally. And my view is that the London Fire Brigade, in the face of those 66 recommendations arising from those 2 statutory processes, is beginning to make fundamental change to almost every area of the business, but still has a long way to go. And it will take time to bring that change, particularly in areas of culture and leadership, where things will need to be embedded. And that, I don't ask for people's trust in that. I expect you to judge us on our outcomes, just as I expect the public to.
Yeah, we'll come on to those in a little while with my colleagues. But you're right, this is more than just ticking off the list. We've done that, few through that onto the next thing. This is fundamentally about this whole organisation that you run, that you lead. And clearly colleagues who sit on the fire committee will get into that detail a lot more. But you've got additional funding going in to transform your organisation. What are we going to get in this next year? What's the outcome at the end of this year to show that you are turning the Titanic round and making those changes? What are your expected outcomes?
The difference is that we've already made. So if we're thinking about the what rather than kind of the why and the how, well, actually, I would like to start with the why. You know, I've got a personal interest in this. I stood in front of the Grenfell Tower for 10 hours and watched the bodies of men, women and children come out of it. It is the single most significant failure of the state of which we are part in the modern era. A tower block in London where people should have been safe, failing to such a degree that 72 people lost their lives. I will hold the images from that night in my head forever. And we owe it, in particular, to dedicated firefighters to bring this change, as much as we owe it to London and obviously the bereaved and survivors. Actually, there were people that night who did unbelievably courageous things, who deserved the change. So I hold this responsibility personally as a result of what I witnessed. What have we done? Well, we have trained, despite the challenges of the pandemic, every single firefighter to respond differently to high-rise fires. We have seen that at New Providence Wharf. We have seen the early evacuation of buildings where the stay put strategy was no longer, sufficient. The very real operational challenges of training people to that, and despite that, we've done it. Actually, we've gone back to a place we should never have gone away from. 20 years ago, when I joined as a firefighter, I used to carry out fire safety visits. We used to give people advice, and actually station officers used to issue enforcement letters. We have now trained all 5,000 firefighters to do that. Once again, that's something that hasn't happened in 20 years, and we will visit thousands of premises, but it will take time to build that confidence and knowledge back to where they can do the lowest level of enforcement. But that's a massive change. That's real for Londoners. If I think about our own people and supporting our own people, the inquiry, and I'm sure this committee would have watched parts of it, would have seen the point at which Mr. Millett just showed me some disturbing examples of where our culture isn't right. And actually, to address those sort of issues, we have commissioned an independent review of our culture led by Nazir Afzal, which I think will pose some very difficult questions, but that is real, that is happening, and I think our workforce will see the benefit of it. And we have commissioned, and it is budgeted for, and it has begun to deliver. We are delivering the largest face-to-face leadership programme in the history of the London Fire Brigade. Why is that important? Because actually it's your leadership that impacts your decision-making at the point you find yourself something at Grenfell. So the communities will experience the benefit of that if we get it right. So I think we're doing tangible things. People sitting in rooms of people, either training them or developing them, and then our people taking that learning forward out onto the streets of London. That's what the investment's about.
Yes, it is absolutely about changing that front line, which is absolutely your comfort zone, but it's also that organisational sort of the behind the scenes bit. And you said you want to get the resource out there into the front line. So just to understand, looking at the budget, you're forecast to draw 1.1 million more than budgeted for from your earmarked reserves on this transformation delivery plan. Are you confident that's enough in this year? And is there a risk that in the next 2 years that you're going to require similar in-year increases?
I think we've planned appropriately, and we're looking at the investment at this point, and I think we're judicious in that. We have unpicked, the London Fire Brigade in detail, as you might imagine, facing that level of statutory scrutiny over the past 2 years. And you're absolutely right about making sure we change things under the skin that, frankly, firefighters will never see and will probably never appreciate. So I'll give you an example. When I came in post in January 2020, I could not have told you rationally what our corporate risks were, because we did not have an appropriate risk management system. We were still reporting to the relevant scrutiny committees, which is inexcusable that we were meeting our own performance targets at a point where inspection was telling us that as an organisation we required total improvement, and the inquiry being equally critical. We have an entirely different risk management framework that is embedded at every level now, and I have about 8 really significant corporate risks, ranging from finance to culture to the built environment, that might present an obstacle to delivering that change. That's proof of something changed under the skin. One of the most significant pieces of evidence I read into the inquiry was that we are still in the process of really trying to get a grip of assurance. I did not have an organisational business assurance framework when I took over, which is frankly extraordinary to say, but I did not. We do have that now based on the Treasury best practice model of 3 lines of defence. We have an independent audit committee that hold me to account before I come into public scrutiny committees, so we know ourselves where things aren't perhaps working well before we come and present ourselves transparently to committees like this. I have an independent operational assurance advisor whose task is to crawl all over the organisation and again find those areas of concern so that we can deal with them and transparently present them into scrutiny. So I think you're absolutely right. We've made investment over the past 2 years to really start to understand our organisation, and actually much of the past 2 years has been bringing about change that the front line will never see but needed to be done just to put in place the building blocks to then deliver the training, the development, the evolution of our culture, leadership. But I in no way think the job is done, and I recognise that the investment will need to continue to be made. If I think about an area of investment that I think we have yet to understand, and I will seek support from both central government and colleagues in the Greater London Authority, and we will potentially have to make efficiencies in other places, is around training. I would like to see firefighters trained in a far better realistic simulated environment in the form of an urban firefighting course, for example, week-long residential. That will cost. We've built some understanding of those costs into the budget going forward, but until we commission the work, we really get into that procurement process, we won't fully know. So inevitably, like all large organisations, the cost of change and the budget to support it will evolve. I think the difference from perhaps where we were in the past, recognising the macroeconomic climate, is that we can't take for granted we're going to get the money. So therefore, we have to challenge ourselves really hard as to what are our priorities, in particular look to shared services, collaboration, driving value out of every other part of the organisation. And again, in respect to this committee, the inspectorate will absolutely demand us of that. We are in a different place from where we were in, say, 2018, when we could come to committees and present just a story of ourselves rather than really be examined by people on the ground.
Yeah. So the example you gave there of additional cost of this potential training course, I can see is a potential cost that you can't predict at the moment. Are there any other concrete examples you could provide about potential cost pressures associated with this transformation plan?
Yeah, I spoke to one at the start of the committee around sustainability and around making sure that we do our bit to meet the Mayor's commitment around the environment. That commitment is real, but for example, the cost of putting in an infrastructure so we can get to a zero-emission fleet of fire engines is very considerable. It's up in the kind of 100 million mark based on current technology. If we were to put it in across all our stations, that's the charging technology. Now, we think that cost's likely to come down, but we will need to negotiate with colleagues across kind of all parts of government to ensure that if we really want to meet those targets, we get the inwards investment we need. And we are, of course, starting to think about that in a concrete way. So that's another cost that might emerge.
Okay, and I don't know who's best to answer this. I'll ask it and you can decide between you. You state in your growth proposals the additional investment in people services for the year will achieve £1 million of savings over the years 23-24 to 24-25. Can you explain to us where and how these savings will be achieved?
I think if possible, I'd like to write to the chair to provide that information. So the growth is represented really by the bringing in of skills and capability that we haven't developed to this point within the London Fire Brigade. So we're bringing in basically a business partner model, which will mean that actually, rather than perhaps a slightly old-fashioned approach to some of our HR support systems, particularly to managers out in the fire station estate, we bring in people who are taking a kind of whole view of how you best support our people, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is individual advisors who are very, knowledgeable, but are focused perhaps purely on discipline and grievance, purely on well-being. purely on payroll and support systems, transactional. We think we need to bring in a better level of support and guidance in a modern way to senior leaders in particular in the organisation. So that's what that's focused on. I think that will then show what areas we can make efficiencies in regard to legacy systems and approaches. But if at all possible, I would like to write to the chair on that matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd be pleased to accept that. I'm just going to mention a couple of points that you've brought up, Commissioner. Just to say, I was a member of LFEPA, which was, of course, the scrutiny board beforehand, and I'm absolutely mortified that we were given incorrect information on that, as indeed would have been our Deputy Mayor for Fire, because she was on LFEPA at the same time as I was. No doubt we'll come back to that. I'd also like to comment that I'm thrilled to bits that you are looking at proper real fire training, because fires have reduced so dramatically in the last 10 years that new recruits just simply don't get the same practice, if you like, on the job. And I think it's absolutely vital that they're put in real situations when they're practicing, as opposed to when they're actually having to deal with it. So I'm really happy to hear that. I'm now going to hand over for further questioning to my colleague, Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to circle back to these environmental pressures, which is presumably making sure your fleet is ULEZ compliant. I actually raised this on LFEPA either in 2016 or in early 2017 as something that the Fire Brigade should be making preparations for. So it's really disappointing to hear that the preparations are as...
We are ULEZ compliant, just to be clear. Our fleet is ULEZ compliant. What we're talking about is looking to move to a zero emission fleet, which is challenging because that technology does not exist in the market. We've had to work with, we went through an advanced procurement process for a research vehicle, which is now complete, and we will launch at some point in the future. But that's the first credible zero emission pumping appliance on the market, certainly in the UK, but probably internationally, because of the challenge of providing a battery sourced pump. It's less, there's clearly electric HGVs out there, but it's the ability to sustain pumping operations over hours that makes that challenging. So we're not talking about whether we're ULEZ compliant. We understand our obligations there, and we've done it. It's more the looking to the future and recognising that if we want to achieve what are rightfully challenging targets around emissions and sustainability, we really need to get ahead of the curve rather than just waiting for the market to give us the solution. We need to drive that change.
Great, that's very reassuring, thank you. I mean, it's not reassuring in terms of the cost and the scale of that, but sorry, I'd misinterpreted
the way I presented
what you said. So coming back to my actual questions, I've got a question for Adrian, I think. How are you addressing the impact of your vacancy rate in the LFC on the delivery of its services? I understand there's 157 vacancies and also 84 agency staff.
Yeah, so excuse me. So that's on the fire and rescue side staff as opposed to operational staff. So yeah, we're experiencing a number of challenges in terms of recruitment and retention of staff. So some of that will be, in particular, we're seeing challenges on fire safety in terms of the staff there, and particularly the skills in that area are very much in demand, and we're finding that there's the market is expanding as well. So as quick as we can grow, we can grow our talent. It's being attracted elsewhere. Excuse me. And then also in terms of other areas, particularly around professional services, we're seeing that there's challenges in terms of recruitment and retention. And part of that is working with colleagues in people services, and as part of the change in the way that we're going forward with people services is to look at the whole offering around FRS staff, both in terms of making sure that we've got the right training in place. The Commissioner alluded to some of that, but also in terms of looking at the way that we recruit people, in terms of where do we go to recruit those staff, and also perhaps over the longer term, looking at the whole remuneration package and how we might do that slightly differently. And certainly within finance, we've had some particular challenges, and that's part of what we're working with SITFA, so the professional accountancy body in the local government sector, to look at what we might need to do differently in terms of structures and just our package that we offer and how we can address that. Certainly in terms of, you mentioned agency staff, so we make use of agency staff to offset some of those FRS staff vacancies. We've seen the number of agency staff go down as we started this financial year with some of the additional recruitment controls we put in place last year because of financial challenges with the pandemic. We've also moved to a new supplier for temporary staff. So we saw a few hiccups as we were transitioning from the old arrangement to the new arrangement. But again, in the kind of pandemic and as people's employment choices are changing, interestingly, we're finding that the cost of agency staff is going up, and people are choosing perhaps temporary careers to permanent careers. So yeah, it's an evolving market that we see for particularly professional staff and in fire safety skills as well in terms of that employment market.
Mm-hmm. I understand in the NHS they're getting very involved in kind of training and training programs, sort of connecting up with the...
Could I perhaps answer that? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we've built our own academy. So if we want to talk about fire safety, we've taken exactly the NHS approaches. We can't rely on the open market to employ fire safety professionals. It's one of the other reasons why we've gone and trained 5,000 firefighters, because that's going to give us a baseline understanding from where we will recruit in the future. Not without its challenges. It's a very, very challenging market out there. The building safety regulator that's coming is also going to poach staff because it needs staff with the same skills. How we're addressing it, and we are the most successful fire and rescue service in the country at doing this, and we need to be, frankly, because of the scale of the risk in the built environment, is we're widening out access to professional qualifications amongst our station-based staff. We've got just over 300 of them now on a level 3 accredited inspection course, which will mean they're the inspectors of the future. Within fire safety, we now run our own academy, which takes people in at a more junior level into the organisation or transferred across from the uniform side, trains them up with a view to retain them. And that process is continuous, and we have closed down the vacancy margin from where we were in fire safety considerably. We could write to you to give you the figures, because I actually think in some ways, in the context of the challenges of the market, it's a success story. At one point, we were down to about 30 vacancies, which is not ideal, but in the context of the hundreds of inspecting officers we have and need, is pretty good from where we started, and this is continuous. So I think we should write to provide you more detail, but you're completely right. That's the approach we must take. We have to grow our skills in-house as much as rely on the open market, because frankly, it's not out there in the open market.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the Chair will be grateful to receive that written response. So, Andy, sort of one more question for you, which is about the financial implications of your culture review and the implementation of its recommendations. What are the financial implications of this?
Well, I genuinely think we've costed in what are likely to be the financial impact of this, because we've already got a very, very significant leadership programme going ahead, which is budgeted in. What I would suggest is that the learning from the review will be built into that, because how you treat each other, how you behave, is implicit within the leadership programme. We have a separate programme of cultural awareness workshops and conversations being rolled out. That, again, is budgeted in, and what I would expect is what goes into that and our approach to it to evolve, because what I don't think we can do is wait for the cultural review to deliver its results. We know ourselves many of the things we need to improve in our culture. I think it's right to bring in someone entirely independent to sense check that and to really exemplify it very clearly to the whole organisation and to explore aspects we might not have considered. But in terms of the mechanisms to actually deliver change, I think they're there. It's the detail that goes into them as much as anything. And obviously we've budgeted for the review itself, and we have a clear cost framework around that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Could I just pick up on that around the culture? Because obviously it's notoriously difficult to change culture. You've got, how are you going to measure success? Because our committee's budget and performance, how are you going to measure that to show that that investment has been successful?
I think there's all sorts of places where you can measure it. You can measure it in the volume of discipline and grievance cases as a starting point. You can measure it in terms of the balance of demographics within those processes. So at the moment, we know, and I've stated it to different committees before, that if you're a black firefighter, you are more likely to get disciplined by some percentage. You know, I would expect to see that reduce if we work with, you know, issues of unconscious bias and discriminatory process and system. We know that you are less likely to get promoted as a woman. Again, I would expect to see that shift. So I think there's some very obvious data-driven examples, but I also think it's about really good people survey, that, you know, the qualitative evidence, going out and asking our workforce whether they feel different, whether it's been of value, what their relationships are like in the workforce. I think there's soft signifiers like sickness, you know, what sort of absence we have in the organisation. You know, sickness related to anxiety and stress is still one of the highest reasons for people going off work in the London Fire Brigade. Perhaps we might see some of that reduce. So I think there's lots of different ways we might measure it, and people are thinking actively about a suite of kind of performance indicators that will tell us whether we're having an impact. And I think actually, to go back to what is always my starting point, I think we need to ask communities whether they're seeing a difference, because I think when we change our culture, we will see a difference in our openness and relationship with communities as well, and we should be going out and asking them.
Thank you. Our sickness figures have always been bad, though, haven't they, Commissioner? So we'll go back to that another time. Just to ask a couple more questions of Adrian, if I may. When will you know the final position of your 0.5 million growth proposal for corporate services, and when will the review be concluded?
A key element of that is a review within finance. So we're working with CIPFA on that review. That review is due to provide preliminary findings by the end of this month. In terms of the wider corporate services piece, that work will continue as we work to appoint the new Director of Corporate Services.
Okay, and which corporate service functions form part of this review? Because the draft budget just said a number. That was on page 12.
I think you've got to turn it on, Adrian. Apologies.
So the initial conversations were with Joe Moore as the interim Director of Corporate Services, and in terms of that broader focus, the primary focus was within finance, but also recognising some of the challenges that we've mentioned earlier in terms of staffing. So to look at potentially across procurement, where there's a new Assistant Director for procurement, but also potentially the wider elements of corporate services.
Okay. I remember we've always looked at procurement and been concerned there, so that'll be an interesting one. Andy, will the £5.4 million training proposal to upskill the LFC staff on counter-terrorism preparedness be delivered in 22-23?
I think it has to be, because the threat is real, not existential. I think we've got an obligation to both Londoners and firefighters to do so. So yes, it is my anticipation that we will press ahead with that.
Okay, and if you start having issues, will you flag them to us? Because I agree with you. I think they should.
We will, but my message to all parties involved in this, both the Home Office, government, the unions, is that we're going to do this because it's right for London and Londoners. And, you know, and there are varying views on aspects of this, but from my point of view, from the experts that we speak to in both the Metropolitan Police and security services, this is the right approach, given the sort of totality of coverage that London needs because of the nature of the threat. So I am clear that within the time period laid out, we need to get to a point where every fire engine in London has the right PPE on it, with properly trained firefighters to respond in the same attendance times to a terrorist incident as they currently provide for fires, in a way that is understood and properly prepared for.
Yeah, good, because that does give us comfort. And what's the anticipated additional pressure on the budget for that in subsequent years?
I think that the additional funding that the Mayor gave us this year is what we're using to fund the acquisition training and then the cost of it rolling forward. And my understanding of that has been built into the baseline budget moving forward.
It has.
It's included, yeah.
Okay, Adrian's nodding. That's
good.
good to hear. It's always good, isn't it? And how does this cost compare with other fire services where similar training has been agreed and rolled out?
They haven't agreed similar training and rolled it out. So I would suggest that the London Fire Brigade and Manchester Fire and Rescue Service will be the first fire and rescue services in the country to provide that totality of cover, and that London is leading the way in that.
Okay, and it compares cost-wise favourably to Manchester then, does it?
Yes, because I think we will probably embark on a similar model.
Okay. And how will you ensure you achieve value for money in the way the money is spent on that additional training?
I think, again, it will be demonstrated in how, I'm afraid, we respond to the instance to which it relates. At the moment, I'm in a position where, whilst we have good specialist teams who provide the specialist counter-terror response, I think every London firefighter should be trained to that level, because what I've seen in London is firefighters who did not have the right level of preparation put themselves into harm's way, for example, on Westminster Bridge.
Yeah.
And I would expect London firefighters to continue to respond that way. I do not think you will see in London what perhaps was seen in Manchester and is emerging from the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry, because we have repeated examples of London firefighters responding with great bravery to terror incidents without always having the right PPE
Absolutely.
or equipment.
Yeah.
But the threat in London is different from almost anywhere else in the UK, and I think it is right that every London firefighter is trained to the kind of level of what is currently seen as the National Fire Service's specialist response, and we will be the first brigade in the country to do that.
Good. Okay. I do have questions on that training because I'm more than interested in that. I'll put it in writing to you if I may.
Thank you, Chair.
For the sake of time. We come now to our last section, which is the capital programme and reserves, and that's taken my colleague, Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much. So looking at your capital programme, so looking at the current year, we've seen a huge underspend, 24.8 million less than budgeted for at the beginning of the year. I think slippage in fleet and estate transformation and so on. So how are you managing, for example, your estate transformation programme to minimise further slippage in the projects and these significant underspends?
Well, I think generally we've taken a completely different approach under new leadership. So Laura Birnbaum has been in for a couple of years now as our new head of property. She's completely turned upside down, really, as part of transformation, our approach to estate management. So I would like to say, I think in general terms, this is a success story. There was a point when I was Assistant Commissioner of Fire Stations where I could not go onto a fire station without the first thing being brought to my attention, rightly by crews, the poor state of the fire station I was sitting in. I was asking them to deliver a professional service while they were sitting in buildings with windows that hadn't been fixed for 2 years. So much of what has happened has successfully addressed much of that, and I don't hear that in the same way now I go to fire stations. So I know the strategy's working in terms of improving what was an ageing and at times poorly maintained estate. The challenge obviously of flexing with what is a shifting capital position, I think I should turn to Adrian to talk about. But as a general principle, I think we are on top of this, and we have built sufficient flexibility into processes to work with what we've got available and prioritise those buildings in greatest need first.
Yeah, certainly what we've seen in the capital delivery of the capital programme is some of the challenges in relation to the pandemic. So in terms of staff being able to, or contractors being able to access sites to progress work, and then also on the fleet side in terms of some of the challenges around those pandemic staffing, but also in terms of movement of key parts in terms of vehicles across borders as those have changed. So I think part of the challenge has been anticipating how those challenges will start to ease, and I think we probably assumed at the start of the year, that particularly around the pandemic, that those things would ease, and then obviously with the extension of the pandemic they've continued to be in place. And some of the property ones where there's significant site redevelopments, you're seeing that some of the tender responses came back at levels higher than we'd anticipated. So again, it's looking at why is that, and what do we need to do to revisit those. So again, that introduces a delay into the programme. In terms of that underspending, I mean, I think part of the challenge for the capital programme is that most of the capital items take a number of years to deliver. So it's less about that those capital programmes will cost less money. It's around the phasing. And so what we've seen is that the delivery are certainly key cost elements moving into later financial year.
Okay, so I understand why you've got some of this slippage, but what are you doing to try to manage it? Because clearly these are things you need to do.
Greater site, and obviously you haven't got the director here, because we're in a process of recruiting a new director for corporate services. So really, it's about having an estate strategy that allows flex, that allows kind of a different approach to managing property, for example, in particular. So taking a whole station approach, not doing works individually, going back round the round repeatedly, to consider where we're making improvements first, where we can actually wait longer and perhaps save money, recognising potential issues within the supply chain, because there are issues around that, around cost and availability of materials, changing the plan in relation to that if necessary. So there is planning being done pretty much all the time around prioritisation and planning of delivery. Obviously, there's a challenge around capital receipts, which means at some point we have to look at borrowing, which I would probably get Adrian to talk to more detail to. It may well be that we do have to look to a greater level of borrowing in the future to kind of manage progress. Would it be helpful for Adrian to speak to that?
Not at the moment. What I really want to understand is you've got this capital programme.
Yeah.
You're clearly reprofiling it because you're looking at how you do the work. But this year you've already seen some slippage.
Yeah.
What are you doing to pull that back? Or are you just saying actually that's part of this because we're rethinking how we do everything? I
think it's a mix of both. I think part of it's pulling back. So sensibly, in individual circumstances, we're looking at where we can reprioritise, where we might not actually carry out some work because it's sustainable not to. And I've got to go back to the target operating model and the community risk management plan. Obviously, as we look ahead, how we use our estate, particularly in collaboration with others, is equally important about how we kind of make best use of that, and where there might be shared investment, for example. But I think we've got to explore those opportunities in greater depth. I mean, the fact that you're here today using this building shows us that when we apply some imagination, we can find a different way to use our estate, and there may well be opportunities we haven't yet identified within that. So I think the answer is we're taking an inquisitive approach to it. There is slippage. You have to accept there's an element of it in what is a very difficult macro kind of economic climate, and some disappointing kind of moments around anticipated capital receipts. So if you think of 8 Albert Embankment.
Well, that's what I'm just going to move on to. Come on, 8 Albert Embankment. Even when I was on FIPA, which feels like a lifetime ago, 8 Albert Embankment was on the table. What's the current situation with that?
Well, so obviously it's really disappointing that the developer lost the right to appeal the Secretary of State's decision. We're back to a place where I need a fire station there. It's vital to that bit of London. But we're considering all of our options, and we will have to develop the site and maintain what is a Grade 2 listed building, and make sure we've got a fire station there. So we're back to the drawing board on that. We're considering all options. That's been done in detail with all relevant stakeholders.
And what's the timescale for a new plan?
I think we've got to give both our advisors, the relevant stakeholders, the developers that were originally involved, the time to consider that. I would expect to see a more developed plan early in the new year as to what those options look like. And again, we've tried to challenge ourselves. We've gone outside of the walls of the London Fire Brigade to do that. So we've gone back into colleagues in the GLA and some of the other bodies. And again, we can write to the chair in terms of some of the conversations we've had with others around how we might approach this differently, looking at the experience of people like the Metropolitan Police in terms of divesting their estate, TfL, and perhaps learning some lessons from elsewhere. I mean, on the positive side, we of course have seen a much better result from the sale of Clerkenwell than we expected, which I think speaks to the leadership of Laura Birnbaum, who's our head of property, who actually stopped us doing what we were doing previously and took a completely different approach to the disposal of that part of our estate, and as a result achieved a much better than anticipated capital receipt. I think if we let her loose on 8 Albion Bankman, which we will now because she's now no longer really burdened by what was almost 13 years of legacy decision making, we may well find we do better.
Okay, we look forward to seeing that. In terms of delivering your capital programme as a whole, you've already touched on some risks. You've talked about supply chain, but are there any other key risks that are worrying you about delivering it?
I think the two major ones are supply chain issues, particularly if you think so much of our capital receipt, our capital investment programme is focused on property, so much of it. Supply chain issues are the major one because they're being experienced by all organisations. The cost of building materials is huge. Access to professional contracting services in terms of doing the work is massive. And then the second one is one we've already just discussed, which is funding. So the capital receipts that have been available in recent years are coming to an end, and therefore that creates an increased reliance on borrowing. They would be the two major issues I would identify.
Yeah. Okay, and then I understand that also it's not really for this year's budget, but that borrowing costs is, as you say, a concern going forward. Can I just pick up the issue finally on reserves? And I don't know whether this is for you or Adrian. Just want to understand your thought process when you've decided to take 6.1 million from reserves in 2022-23, another 6.1 the year after, and then another 4.4 million, reducing your overall level of reserves. What's your thought process on that, and is it sustainable?
I think it goes back to a previous answer, which is no, not beyond the medium term. But we did it really because we thought it was good financial planning in the context of the uncertainty in the macroeconomic environment. We needed to build ourselves a buffer, recognising that there, like all the other public sector organisations in London, there was both real uncertainty and real pressures on us, and identifying an appropriate amount of money going into budget reserves to ensure we continue to balance the budget as required to seemed sensible.
And how does this compare to other fire authorities, fire, whatever you're called now, fire brigades across the country? How does it compare in terms of the level of reserve compared to budget? What does your auditor say on it?
I think that our auditors are fairly clear that it's an appropriate use of reserve, and actually I think we're in a better position, I'm afraid, than some of my colleagues around the country, particularly in county brigades, where, for example, it appeared to me that they hadn't planned forward always necessarily for incoming pressures around unanticipated pay rise, for example, the potential issues around capital and supply chain. So actually, I think, to give due credit to my colleagues in the LFB who planned forward in front of, for finance, it was right to make use of the reserves in that way and plan to make use of the reserves in that way.
And you still have enough there, more than other places?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're in a good position compared to most other fire and rescue services. And I think what we're doing, whilst I absolutely respect the challenge from this organisation and the committee here, that we can't just rely on reserves. We don't think we can. It does also speak to the Minister's very direct intervention on this matter, which was he would like to see fire and rescue services across the country make better use of the reserves that were available to manage the uncertainty of finance during the pandemic. So we did listen to that and attempt to do our best.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions left. We'll write to you if we could have the answers to them. But I would like to thank our guests for attending and answering our questions. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Deputy Mayor for Fire, Fiona Twycross. She's done some incredible work around emergency planning regarding COVID, and we all really appreciate that. And of course, she's very poorly at the moment, and we wish her, I'm sure, all of us well. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Noted. Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 2021-22? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 17th of December 2021 at 10 a.m. in these committee rooms G02, 3 And 4, at the London Fire Brigade headquarters. I have not been given notice of any other business, so I will close the meeting. Thank you.